Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by WebHealer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. WebHealer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, WebHealer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the WebHealer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, WebHealer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 350 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is an online integrative counsellor who specialises in eating disorders, body image, weight stigma and domestic violence. She has delivered seminars on weight stigma at both Edinburgh University and the Departments for Work and Pensions, sharing her expertise on body image and its impact. We're delighted to welcome back Mel Ciavucco to the podcast as she shares her thoughts on the rising use of weight loss drugs and explores how counsellors may best support clients who are using them. And with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 350 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly. We're going to walk you through the 3 stops today, starting with our ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about starting as a counsellor, what you need to think about when you kind of go from being a student into practice. We then go into practice matters, and Rory's already teed up the discussion he had with Mel, and that is, of course, about disordered eating and weight loss drugs, so be sure to stick around for that one. And then we recognise you, the students, on your formal journey in student services, where today we're speaking about getting reasonable adjustments on a counselling course. So that's what we've got to look forward to, and we start off with that ethical, sustainable practice. I guess it's a big move, isn't it, Rory? You go from being a student, you're now a counsellor, you're qualified. What happens? What does that journey look like?
Well, I think it's a bit of a transition because as a student, you are usually in some form of agency where you're working in placement. That's the term, isn't it? Placement. And as a placement therapist, you'll have a huge support system. And part of that support system will be a more experienced colleagues who triage clients to see who should. It doesn't happen with every placement, I have to say, but usually what happens is the more shall we say complex clients, if that's even a word, I'm just using a word to make an example, if you like, are usually seen by more experienced therapists. And as a student, usually, not exclusively, but usually you see the worried well. And when you leave the agency and you work for yourself, or even stay on at the agency and may get a position there, you'll be seeing more complex clients. Now, here's the thing, Ken. Counselling theories that are taught in college, generally speaking, are 20th century theories. Rogers, Beck, all the great names that you hear are all 20th century theorists. And Carl Rogers, he died in 1985. And what happened? Sorry, 1987. I'll get letters if I don't get this right. 1987. And it wasn't until 1980 that post-traumatic stress disorder, and I use the disorder thoughtfully, was something that came into the awareness of practitioners. 7 years later, Rogers sadly was no longer with us, and it kind of heralded the beginning of 21st century clinical thinking, and it's never stopped. So trauma is a 21st century idea, how we engage with it in the therapy room. Online and telephone counselling, something that really wasn't discussed widely, certainly not in my circles, until after 2020 and the great pandemic, as it's now being referred to. And also the rise of neurodivergent people, the emergence through the change of vocabulary and the acknowledgement that autistic people now exist in the world, and as such may need a different form of support or a different approach. That could go on. We could talk about LGBTQA. We could talk about race and culture. All of these are really 21st century ideas. And I think, part of the journey of a therapist is to engage in 21st century ideas, because we are meeting, and here's the thing, 21st century clients, not 20th century ones.
Oh, beautifully tied with the bow there at the end, Rory. Yes, it's an interesting time, and our daughter has just graduated from her master's, and she expects that as she graduates from her master's that she's going to go into the sector that she studied into, and that she's going to start on the bottom rung of a ladder, and she's going to build her career there. And I think that's an interesting mindset, because when we look at counselling and psychotherapy, not in all cases, but in many cases, it's often visited maybe after you've gone out and lived some life. So you may be a more mature student, maybe have already done those bottom rungs of the ladders climbing. But there is an expectation when you graduate as a counsellor that you will, I guess, be near the bottom of the rung, and this is evidence. If you look at counselling jobs that are advertised, that they might say, that they want you to have the qualifications and they want you to be a member of an ethical body, but they also want a minimum of 2 years experience type of thing. And it almost feels like a catch-22, Rory. I'm going to be honest. I see this so often in the Facebook group. How do I get the 2 years experience if it's so difficult to get in the door? And I think you've actually touched on the gold here. So when we look at what your course gives you, what do you do in your course? Well, it teaches you the theory, it teaches you the skills that you need for engaging with the client, it teaches you the ethics, working within an agency, working to an ethical framework. But there's so much. Those are like the cornerstones of counselling, but there's so much that the clients will teach you and that you'll learn from your interactions as you grow and as you work. And as you said, Rory, there are so many areas, the counselling training, they can't teach you every presentation and every specialism, but there are so many areas that are worth studying in. And when you come to the end of your formal studies, I've now finished studying, I'm now a counsellor, well, that's when the studying begins, because it's lifelong commitment to study. If you look at your ethical body, they're going to be requesting 35 hours a year of formal CPD, continuing professional development, studying in specialist areas. And I think a great question here, Rory, we've spoken about our why on the podcast before. I think a good question is, if you're going out and you're starting out as a counsellor, psychotherapist, what are the areas that you should maybe consider studying in first? What is going to give you that, leap forward? What is going to make you stand out from the others on the CV? You've mentioned a few of them already, Rory. And yes, they get you into maybe the job that you want to have, but also as soon as you start niching down or specializing in a certain area, you can experience such growth and expansion in your practice, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're always in the service of clients. That's what we are. We're in service. And as part of being in service, we need to meet clients where they are. And sometimes, we want to niche down. So we might want to niche with clients who may have experienced trauma, or we might want to work with the LGBTQA plus community, or we may be very interested in working with race and culture, and the discussions that go on there. But generally speaking, even if we don't niche down, we're meeting members of the population who are more diverse, have more awareness of who they are than they ever did 20 years ago. When I left training 25 years ago, it was expected that pretty much, you'd qualified and you might want to do some other work. You might want to train as a supervisor. You might want to go for accreditation. But generally speaking, the demand or the expectation of doing huge amounts of CPD really wasn't there. And it was only, 3 or 4 years after I qualified that the profession started to become professional. In other words, we started to become less of an emerging profession and more of an emerged profession with the demands that entails. So even if you're not niching down, to have an understanding of a lot of different areas of counselling work, I think is very, very useful. And let's be honest, Ken, if you're working with a general population, you're going to meet people who are neurodivergent. You're going to meet people who have experienced trauma. And I have very few regrets in my career, but if I look back at the 20 years of work, I sometimes catch myself thinking about maybe a client comes into awareness, and I think, I wonder how I would have approached this client had I known what I know now. Mm. And that is the whole point of CPD. That's the whole point of it, of developing your practice. Because as Maslow said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem becomes a nail.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. And I think it reflects how we mature, grow, and recognize that growth through our CPD. If you're asking yourself in the here and now, how would I have been with that client knowing what I know now? It shows that there's a leap forward. It shows that there's been an area of growth in the area. And, it's tricky. So the questions are always asked in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of that, go to Counselling Tutor. Go to Facebook and put in Counselling Tutor and you'll find us. Come and join the conversation there. A lot of individuals, graduating, first finding that chicken and egg situation. How do I get a job without the experience? How do I get the experience when I can't get a job because I need the experience? And then what comes after that is, what areas can I specialize in, or what should I do first? Because there's so much CPD out there. If you look up counseling CPD, there's just like an endless list. I mean, we've got a CPD library and there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of different topics and presentations within that. Where do you start? And I think, Rory, that a great starting point is trauma. You've mentioned trauma. Yeah. And you've mentioned it as a 20th century presentation. And of course, trauma has always been presenting. It's just that we have different words and different understanding and different research to understand it better now and look at it and recognize it in the same way as neurodivergence is not just suddenly showing itself. It has always been there at some level. It's just that we maybe are more educated and now more able to see that. I think trauma is a really good starting place for any CPD, even if it's a light trauma CPD course in the Counselling Tutor Library, or making a commitment and doing a formal module, a formal training course on trauma, because it's certainly something that you're going to be recognizing and seeing within your practice. You'll see it straight away. As soon as you start learning about it, you will start recognizing where it is there, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key word here, or the phrase, is informed. You don't have to be an expert in these things. It's informed. And I think that, when a client shares their story with you, if you're informed, it means that you are attuned. Informed helps attunement to where the client is. And that attunement is part of being empathic, being present, and also being supportive, being able to understand the client's frame of reference better. That is why, when we do training, we look at diversity in our courses, because the reason for that is we're trying to understand the other's frame of reference. And I think by, tuning up your training, by just taking the odd course, maybe doing some CPD, what happens is that your approach becomes sharper, more deliberate. That's an area that we talked about a lot on the podcast, deliberate practice. It's more deliberate. You're in better service. And, there may be those people listening that said, well, I've spent a load of money and a load of time training to learn one modality of therapy. And now what you're telling me, Rory and Ken, is I've got to learn a load more modalities. No, what we're saying is that this is an attunement. It's not a whole load of theory that you have to ingest. It's an addition, it's an adjunct to what we already know to make your practice more 21st century focused.
I like that. I love the word attunement that you used there, and I think it is an attunement, and it broadens your practice range and enables you, when it is appropriate, to go deeper with the clients, because you're informed. And so often it's been said on this podcast, the client can only go as far as you, the counsellor, can go, and we're in service during that CPD. So I mentioned that my first choice would be trauma, and this is looking back now. It wasn't my first choice when I left my training. My first choice was actually something that was quite niche at the time, and it was online telephone and email counselling. And I'm really glad I did that, because it was very, very many years before it became so popular as it is today. It really, I guess, became essential during COVID. But I then had something that I was able to see people outside of my town, and that was important to me. I was looking at my long-term career, and I wanted to use that as a kind of a bridge to speak about that long-term career, because when you finish your studies and you recognize, yes, okay, I'm going to be studying for the entire time that I'm going to be a counsellor or psychotherapist, at least in my CPD, working on my practice in service of my clients, there are times where you look at your why. Why did I do this? We've spoken about it before. And where does that lie? Where does my why want to take me? Is there a specialist area? And I mentioned the word earlier, and it can be an ugly word. It's the word niche. I see a lot of confusion about what is a niche and how do you know where to niche and all that. So I'm going to kind of go into niche a little bit here. So it may be, and I'm going to use an example. I'm busy writing a book at the moment on going into private practice, and the chapter on niching is around, looking at what fulfills you. And it may take a few years of doing some CPD to find what it is that fulfills you. But if you find a certain client group or a certain group of people that you feel that you want to work with, and you work at your best with, it lights you up, and you feel energized when working with that kind of a presentation or that kind of a group, that might indicate that it keys into your key why of making a difference in people's lives, and you may choose to focus your training in that specific area. I'm going to use an area that is of interest to me, and that's neurodivergence. I'm proudly autistic, diagnosed at age 50, and once I saw it within myself and started studying and formally studying, I saw so much need. And if I was to specialize or niche right now, Rory, I would niche into being a counselor who works with individuals that are autistic or have autistic members of their family, because it's important to me. It's important to me. And what it does is it gives me a career direction. Putting a listing on a ethical body directory saying I'm a counsellor and I work with this and this and this and this and this and this looks very similar to another person's listing on that directory. When you niche and you say, I specialize in working with clients who are autistic or have family members who are autistic, it's going to resonate with less people, but it's going to resonate with the right people. And there's a thinking that if I narrow it down, specialize in one area, I'm going to be discounting tens of thousands of potential clients. But the truth is, you usually find that the practitioner who does niche down is busier than a general practitioner because they have a specialist area. So if I was looking for a counsellor right now and I just got my autism diagnosis, I'd want to look for someone who is trained in that area to work with them. I would want to work with a specialist. So I would go looking for that person. So it enables you to stand out. I think there's a lot of considerations, and it can take some time to find where your specialist area might be or your niche area might be. And it may be as simple as I offer my services online. That can be a niche area, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also something to consider is that, you know, the general public are now more informed than they ever were. The internet, social media, periodicals. You know, I was in my local supermarket and I'd glance at the magazines, and some of the topics that were focused on the magazines were really about individual perceptions of the world. Neurodiversity. Lots of celebrities that are neurodiverse, people openly speaking about trauma. And as such, clients are now more discriminating, I think, in who they want to see. Certainly towards the end of my private practice, the conversations weren't, do you have any availability? It was, do you work in this area? The base qualification, clients weren't so concerned about, but they would ask. I work with children and young people, and parents would say, do you have any child and children qualifications to work with children? And also towards the end of my private practice, people would contact me because I advertised that I work with trauma, that I knew about trauma. So what you're doing is you're actually matching the client's need to your service. And if you're a shop and you're selling apples and someone comes in and says, I want oranges, if you now supply oranges, you're more likely that people will take the oranges and the apples. So to use that metaphor, if you are, if you're multi-skilled, then you're more likely to get more inquiries and convert those inquiries into clients. And that's the way the world works.
It is, and it's maybe it's not made clear at the beginning of the journey to study counselling of what this looks like. I certainly only saw as I was doing my training that it unfolded as I was going along. But I mean, we could speak for days on this topic. It is a really, really deep topic. Rory has made a beautiful handout that you can get. It's absolutely free of charge, and you can get it by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 350, that's 350, and you can download the handout of what every new counsellor needs to know. It covers everything that we've discussed today, plus some extra bits in there as well, some reflection points for you as well to consider for yourself. It's your practice, and you're going to be guiding your practice for as long as you're in it. So this is a great place to start on that, and that is ethical, sustainable practice. And of course, if you're interested in any specialized training, go to counsellingtutor.com, click on our products tab, and you'll notice we've tried to choose training courses or CPD formal courses that are going to give you a more sustainable practice by opening those other audience areas. So you can go and have a look at that too. So we now move from our ethical, sustainable practice, Rory, into practice matters. You spoke to Mel. You introduced Mel beautifully at the beginning of this podcast. And we're speaking about disordered eating and weight loss drugs, Rory.
Yes, it's a story of our time, Ken. I met two neighbours recently who confided in me that they were using Mounjaro, which is a weight loss drug. And I speak to a lot of people who use it on a regular basis. I caught up with Mel Ciavucco, who's discussed disordered eating and weight loss drugs, and some of the things that may not be as clear when people start to take them. She spoke with passion about it, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
In recent years, weight loss drugs such as Wegovy, Ozempic and Mounjaro have become a part of an everyday conversation and even a new social norm. They've been making the headlines too. Back in December 2024, Helen Kirain from Diabetes UK told the BBC that Mounjaro could play a significant role in tackling obesity. But alongside the excitement, there are important questions about the impact of these drugs, particularly when it comes to body image, weight stigma and disordered eating. My guest today is Mel Ciavucco, an integrated counselling trainer who specialises in precisely these areas. Mel works as an online counsellor and also delivers training and workshops for individuals and professionals. With years of experience in eating disorder charities, she brings a deep passion for supporting people with body image and eating concerns of all kinds. In this conversation, we're going to explore the nuances of weight loss, body confidence, and what these new medications might mean for clients, counsellors, and society as a whole. So, Mel Ciavucco, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you. Really glad to be here again, talking about this topic. It's such a huge topic, really. Hope we can do this justice and give a little bit of insight in the time we have today. I'm
sure we can. And I'm going to make a bit of a disclosure. I've suffered with disordered eating since I was a child. It's only more recently I managed to get a handle on it. So I was very interested in a blog post that you published titled "On Speaking Up in a Diverse Space, Why It Can Be Hard to Talk About Weight Loss Injections and Why I'm Doing It Anyway." And if you're interested in that blog post, if you go to Counselling Tutor, go to episode 350, go to the podcast tab, and you'll find a link to that blog post in the show notes. So in your post, you mentioned feeling vulnerable and compelled to speak out about weight loss injections despite the pushback. What's going on there? It seems to be a conflicted position you're in, vulnerable but compelled.
Yes, yeah. So I think for me, this is part of something that I actually struggled with right through training as well, is as somebody who's kind of an activist, I say kind of because I guess I feel like a bit of a lazy activist, but so an activist and advocate for people in larger bodies, for people with eating disorders, for my areas of interest. And I feel very strongly about writing on those topics and speaking out about those. But as a therapist in the room, there's this kind of sense that you have to be sort of different to that. When I started training, I thought, I better try and put this activist bit in a box. Obviously that didn't work. And that ended up actually just being a big part of my work. So it's sort of the same with weight loss injections, because I feel like as an eating disorder therapist, I need to be able to talk about the harms and the dangers and the risks around these, because there is, from what I'm seeing, overwhelmingly positive stuff about them. Everyone's taking them. For me, I see adverts all the time on my social media feeds. I mean, I know I can hide them, but it's another point that, they're everywhere. And it feels like the big thing that everybody sort of needs to do. I'm not tempted myself because I've done enough work on myself that I wouldn't do that. I'm in a larger body myself, but I would personally wouldn't take these drugs. So it's difficult because it is one of those, your own biases play into this, your own relationship with food, your own relationship with your body, and everything ties into this. And for me, it's about wanting to speak out, but then also making making it clear that I work quite differently in a room with people. So I work with people taking weight loss injections, as well as people who've had weight loss surgeries, people engaging in different behaviours, dieting or disordered eating, whatever. And I don't judge about any of those because I know the culture that we live in, and I've lived in it myself, and I've been affected by it by myself. Like, I thought I had to be thin ever since I was born, I think. So I'm very affected by it myself, and I understand the allure and the pull. So that's why it's kind of complicated. That's why it's a bit conflicted. So I try and do both these things together, but then say I'm anti-diet culture, not anti-people who diet. Kind of very critical of weight loss injections, but I'm not judging anyone who takes them.
Yes, okay. I think that's an important point, isn't it? And you do speak about the risks. Now, I'm neither of us, as far as I know, are medical doctors or researchers in this area. But I mean, I think you don't have to look very far to hear that there are possible risks of weight loss injections. So what would you say were those risks?
Well, yeah, you're right. So, Rory, I'm going to focus more on the psychological side of things here because it's not my domain at all to be talking on other sides. But I suppose, and also through the lens of disordered eating as well. There are practical risks in terms of where people purchase them if they're buying them online, who can purchase them online, which seems to be pretty much anyone. I definitely know people with eating disorders that have been able to purchase weight loss injections online. It means potentially young people, vulnerable people with anorexia potentially could actually buy them online. So the way that I talk about these, it's more if somebody is sort of being, let's say, well supported, taking them through the NHS and they've been prescribed them, that's not too much of my concern, to be honest. It's sort of, people need support and care from the beginning, middle, and then potentially the end as well, because that's a big one coming off them as well. And as long as, people have that, then that's fine. But the NHS is limited because, for the obvious reasons that we know, time and resources and things. So I think that what I'm seeing is a lot more people are buying them privately outside of it. I've spent some time in like Facebook groups online of people who buy these medications online and then don't really know how to manage them. So they go online to speak to other people and say, what should my doses be? This is happening, this side effect's happening. And of course, this has just been answered by other general people also working it out for themselves in a Facebook group. So there just isn't like the support around it that's needed. My concern from a disordered eating perspective is that disordered eating will be overlooked or will be worsened by this, or when people come off them will be worsened as well. So there is sort of maybe some disordered eating might be created by these, but also people who had disordered eating before going on them to help with that. So an example is that I've seen people, celebrities, influencers online, talk about having binge eating and that these drugs can treat them, which they can't. There isn't evidence for that yet. There isn't enough research on it to know what these drugs are like with eating disorders. I would anticipate when they do, it's not going to be great. I mean, what they say for binge eating is that it can quieten food noise and cravings and things, but no one says what food noise actually is, and nobody really talks about that. And actually, if you take a drug to mask it, then what happens later on when you come off it? So really, in my view, like weight loss injections can mask a whole host of disordered eating and body image problems that may actually be the thing that we really need to be looking at. I mean, it might be that if people are in counselling, they might be on weight loss injections and doing that as well. So great, because often people will say that what they do in the weight loss injections and with weight loss surgery is that they kind of forget about the psychological aspect of it as well. That even when they lose weight, they still hate their bodies. So that it comes, hand in hand with doing something, whether people choose to take them or not. There's probably a lot more risk as well. The main thing is that also we don't know what happens after 2 years because the NHS gives them for 2 years because that's the research that we have. And I know that lots of people are buying them online and then just saying, this is working, I'm going to stay on them forever. That's it. that scares me. The thought of that a little bit, because we don't know what's going to happen down the line with these drugs at the moment. There's research based on people taking them for diabetes, but that's different to this. So yes, I think there's very few risks there, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I think what I'm hearing is there's a clear place for this type of medication. In my research, certainly they're being prescribed appropriately, and I use the term appropriately, with medical oversight for people with diabetes, to be able to help them manage their weight and therefore manage the diabetes. But I think what you've described is a rather ad hoc use of this for some people, where they may have disordered eating, or they may have anorexia, I'm presuming bulimia, and they're using it to, I guess, go alongside that psychological state. And I think clearly, with either bulimia or anorexia, there is a real danger, isn't there? So, and also, I guess what I am hearing is that without addressing the causes of disordered eating, then the drug may be literally I hate to use another medical term, a sticking plaster, that people will use it without looking at the structure of their disordered eating and why they do it.
Yeah, exactly. This could especially be the case for people who binge eat, because when we talk about binge eating, we think about binge cycles. So that being normally, this happens in dieting as well. It's sometimes called a shame cycle, because obviously it's got difficult emotions in it, like shame. So it can be that people decide to go on a diet, get some cravings, fail the diet, air quotes, fail, and end up binging on certain foods or eating something they shouldn't. And then they go back into that restriction again, or dieting, or whatever that is again. It takes them around in that cycle. And weight loss injections can really just form a part of that, but on a much longer scale. So it's an appetite suppressant, really. Some people find that their hunger or food noise or whatever comes back if they're taking it weekly. It might even start coming back in by the end of the week. But for other people that keep taking it long term, it's going to form part of that until they come off. And research so far is showing that when they come off, people are going to gain weight. A lot of people are gaining all the weight back again. Like other weight loss interventions, diets, various things, often people do gain weight back after all that, which is heartbreaking really for them, because they've tried so hard. People will potentially have spent a lot of money on weight loss injections as well, just for them to at the end. So we say somebody comes off after 2 years, which is what the NICE guidelines, the NHS recommend, then potentially they're going to be breaking that cycle, and then it might risk them maybe going into some more disordered eating. So they might start restricting food intake more and to compensate, if they think, well, I'm coming off these injections and I'm going to gain weight, and that's terrifying for them. So they might decide to start restricting food or compensating with exercise, over exercising. So there's those risks of coming off it as well. I think for me, it's always good if you're going to go on these drugs, or anyone does, to have a sort of exit plan, because you never know what's going to happen. Like they're going up in price as well. If you're buying them like off the internet, they could go up in price at any time. So it's almost like there needs to be really good preparation for going on them. I would hope that if someone's going through the NHS, I know your BMI needs to be over a certain amount, and you need to have a comorbidity, like weight-related thing with it as well. So a lot of people aren't eligible, and that's why they go off and find them elsewhere. For the people that are eligible, I would hope that they're getting sufficient care that they need, and that they would I would hope they would know if someone was going in with disordered eating or with binge eating. I would hope that would come out of it at some point, but I can't really hold my breath, because I know a lot of people, they don't necessarily think that what they have is disordered eating. They don't call it binge eating, and sometimes medical professionals don't get very much training. Well, they don't. Doctors only get an hour or two on eating disorders, so they could miss it. Yeah. And so they might still end up going through with disordered eating and not be picked up. And then they're sort of taking an appetite suppressant, which is what these injections are. Any appetite suppressant is not going to help any form of disordered eating at all. Definitely not binge eating, because binging can so often be part of restriction as well, if that makes sense, because of that binge restrict cycle. So it's really, really unhelpful at best, dangerous and really risky as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It paints quite a bleak picture. And I suppose that if a therapist is working with a client in the therapy room, and they've come regarding body issues, body confidence, and they'd start taking these drugs, taking these injections, and this is being talked about in therapy. What do you think the therapist might have to consider when working with a client who's clearly presenting with an issue that is a psychological one, but is treating it in a pseudo medical way?
Yeah, it's really tricky. I'd say the first thing for therapists, for anyone, is to have probably a base knowledge of body image, do some CPD on body image and disordered eating. So you've got a bit of knowledge of that, and when it might be out of your scope of competency, if you need to send to someone who's more of an eating disorder therapist. So that's one thing. And also to have kind of thought about your own relationship with food and your own weight biases, because we all live in a society that basically says thin is good, thin is healthy, and strive to be thin as much as you can. You know, we live in a really strong diet culture where we all have kind of biases towards that as well. And I think there's really reflective work to be done on that for all therapists. So I think as a preemptive thing, that will really help. And then in the room, if the person might not be coming to talk about body image or anything at all, and they might be taking weight loss injections and be stable on them, which is fine. If they've come wanting to talk about body image and disordered eating, there's a lot to explore in there with them. And if they say they're considering taking weight loss injections, I'd say just explore everything that you can with them. Because if it is that they're just, you know, we live in a world of social media where they might be seeing a lot of people speak very positively about them. They really need to do their research. It's obviously all of this is their personal choice, but it's a choice based on us living in a world that has a very strong sway because of diet culture. So I think just exploring it as much as possible, thinking about what happens if they want to come off them in the future, how they would come off them, what might happen. You might have people come to you who are already on them and want to come off. Maybe they can't afford them anymore. Maybe they get side effects that they can't, that are really horrible, and they need to come off them. And that will probably be quite difficult for them, because there could be a lot of fear of weight gain, fear of food noise, which in my opinion, food noise is actually a lot of anxieties that come up in disordered eating. So really thinking about thoughts and behaviours, like thoughts that come up, conflicting thoughts. I find that there's often a lot of conflicting thoughts that people have. You should eat this, you shouldn't eat that, your body looks like this, you're this, that. Critical voices as well, which often stem from way back. Think about earlier childhood as well, what the messages were when they sat down to eat, what the messages were about their bodies. Most people, including myself, if they've had some body image problems, that's probably started quite early. If you ask them, they'll probably say they were really young when they first felt like they weren't thin enough or their body wasn't right. So there's so much in this to explore. And whether they're choosing to take weight loss drugs, that is their choice. We shouldn't be telling them not to. We shouldn't be telling them to take them. We just need to be supporting and exploring and everything around it so that they can make an informed decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's something that we obviously need to take to supervision as well. You know, we need to take the totality of clients' presentations to supervision to explore. And I would think you're absolutely right. My generation, I mean, I'm 67 now, was brought up on you had to finish all of your food on the plate, and with stories of rationing in the war and, you know, children in other countries starving to death. They'd be glad of your food. And I'm sure that is true, but I don't think it's a good enough reason to eat more, to eat more than you need. It's not a good message. It's not a good message for children to eat your plate because of what might be happening in other countries. Finally, when people hopefully will read your article, your blog post. I found it very insightful and listened to our conversation. What do you hope that therapists who listen to this might take away from both the post and our time together today?
I mean, one of my main aims is always to raise awareness of eating disorders and disordered eating, because I think, but people don't really think about it enough. It's not really in our training enough. And just to kind of bring that perspective to weight loss injections, which is really being left out at the moment. I think people just forget about that sort of lens of it. And hopefully it might entice people to learn maybe a little bit more about that and think about their own relationship with food and bodies as well, and maybe do a bit more. I've got loads for the blog posts on stuff to do with this as well. So there's plenty more reading and learning out there. I've got a resources page on my website as well. So I think for me, it's about really helping people understand more about diet culture, weight stigma, because this is, having weight loss injections in the world means that this is only going to reinforce the thin ideals that we already have and the diet culture that we're already in, and what that means for people in larger bodies when we actually live in a world that makes it really hard for us. A lot of people have been bullied and stigmatized and discriminated against. So I would love this to be a springboard for people to learn more about that.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you want to read Mel's blog post, or you want to look over a website and gain those resources, or maybe reach out if you may want any further CPD or training, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, episode 350, you'll find the link to Mel's blog post, and from there you'll be able to explore her website. And it just goes for me to say, Mel Ciavucco, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Mel Ciavucco. A massive thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. And it really, just listening now to Mel, it keys in to the first topic we were speaking about, that when you become a counsellor, there's still that learning to do. 20th century learning, everything that we need to understand and know. And, we look to our peers for sharing that information, and you can always get it from your peers in Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. So we're now back out of Practice Matters, straight into student services. This is where we see you, students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, a psychotherapist, or to learn skills from counselling and psychotherapy that you might use in other areas of your work. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. And today, Rory, this is an interesting and an important topic, and maybe as a student you're not aware of it. There's a thing called a reasonable adjustment, and it's to do with your studies, and we're going to be speaking about getting reasonable adjustments on a counselling course. I think let's start us off, Rory. What is a reasonable adjustment? Because then you're not really told about them. They might be hidden in your handbook, but you've got to look for them. But give us an overview. What is a reasonable adjustment?
Well, I think a very straightforward reasonable adjustment may be having a sign language interpreter in the room if you're a hearing impaired or deaf student. That is a very straightforward, reasonable adjustment. And certainly when I taught, we had interpreters who came in to work with a student who was deaf. That was her own definition. That's how she defined herself. And that was a reasonable adjustment. In other words, without that adjustment, she would have struggled with the course and would have been excluded. So that's a reasonable adjustment. Another reasonable adjustment may be coloured overlays. I used to have a big batch of coloured overlays, which are like plastic A4 sheets in different colours, and you would give them to students who may struggle reading. And once the coloured overlay was put on the text, the words became more legible. So that's a reasonable adjustment. And then, of course, we have reasonable adjustments such as making sure that if a wheelchair user is being taught, that they could access not only the classroom but the facilities, the restrooms, that type of thing. There's, if in case of fire, there's a plan to help that student safely evacuate the building. And of course, the list goes on. I'm a dyslexic person, and the reasonable adjustment I had by my very caring tutor, who probably didn't know a lot at the time, I think, about dyslexia, printed the handouts on huge pieces of paper. So everybody had an A4 handout, and I had an A3 one. I looked like I had a billboard, and it wasn't that helpful for me, but I appreciated the gesture, and eventually I had a quiet word with him, and I just got a handout like everybody else, and that was fine. But I remember him giving them out, and everybody looking at me. Mine was huge, and it was a huge handout. It was like literally an A3 piece of paper, and someone did say, "Do you have sight issues, Rory?" And I said, "No." And it was on yellow. I remember he did it on yellow as well, bless him. And I think that speaks to asking the student what reasonable adjustment they need and not presuming. And I guess that's the reason I've put this topic in. And I've got this topic from our Facebook page. It's no secret that for the topics, we go into our Facebook group. If you're not a member, Counselling Tutor into Facebook, just type it in and you'll find us, and you could join the conversation. And somebody was saying that they were autistic and dyslexic, and they were nervous. They were nervous about asking for reasonable adjustments. Lots of supportive comments, directing them to what they could do, what they might say. But it can be pretty daunting. I mean, I remember sitting there thinking, if I ask for reasonable adjustments, will my tutor think I'm a bit dim? Or what will my peers think? And for that, and that's one of the reasons I probably never asked. And it was only when I put my first assignment in, I was taken to one side, and they said, were you dyslexic by any chance? And I said, well, but yeah, I think I am. I've never been diagnosed, but I think I am. And then this huge yellow A3 piece of paper arrived in the next lesson. So, that, again, not being consulted, and the person who did it for the right reasons. A lovely, lovely, lovely man, who was just doing what the guidance would have told him to do at the time. I mean, we're talking a quarter of a century ago. But now it's a case of actively engaging with it. I would hope that learning institutions at the briefing talk directly about reasonable adjustments and ask students to say, if you need reasonable adjustments, make an appointment and we'll see you in private and we'll see what adjustments we can make for you. And it'll be an ongoing process. So it won't just be, well, we'll give you a coloured overlay and we'll see you next year. It'll be about catching up in a couple of weeks and saying, how's that going for you? Is there anything else we can do? Because we don't want to leave anybody behind as tutors. It's semper fidelis, always faithful. Never leave anybody on the field of learning behind. Never leave them behind.
Agreed. And you mentioned about your study journey, Rory, and reasonable adjustments. Well, I only heard the words reasonable adjustments when I did my teacher training, when I was training to become a tutor. It was the first time I heard it, and I'd kind of already been through my counselling journey, and I'm dyslexic, terribly dyslexic. And I remember dyslexia being a massive barrier. I haven't shared this before, but this is one of those horrific moments from my life. Went for a job interview, and they gave me a form to fill in on a clipboard with a pen. And I knew as I was writing just my name at the top, I just knew when they read through this, they're going to see how atrociously I spell, and they're going to make a judgment on me based on that. My handwriting was pretty illegible as well, and the reason for that is that was kind of the defense mechanism I'd developed, with my spelling, because I couldn't write the words the right way. I didn't know the spelling. I thought if I kind of just put a vague outline of what the word is, then people will not see that my spelling is so bad. I'll write like a doctor. People used to say that when they looked at my handwriting. And what happened, of course, within that moment, and this is, it was horrible. I had a trauma response where I couldn't think. I started sweating. My sweat was dropping down onto the paper that I was writing on. I was obviously dressed in with a jacket and a tie, so I was really hot. And by the time I sat in front of the person who was interviewing me, I was an absolute mess. Because of my dyslexia. I never thought and I never knew there was a thing called a reasonable adjustment. So here's what a reasonable adjustment is. Within your learning institution, there are adjustments that can be made if you struggle in certain areas. And it is in your tutor's interest to put those in place. In fact, your tutors are kind of, they're checked that they are making reasonable adjustments and that they are checking what people's learning styles are and acting in that way when they are audited. And it's just about having that conversation and saying what your challenge is. I was very happy when I started training Rory, specifically with you, and you started spelling everything wrong on the on the whiteboard and saying I can't spell. I was thinking, wow, my tutor can't spell and I can't spell. And you know what that did? It gave me permission. And I knew that within my submitted work, once you knew I was dyslexic, I wasn't going to be pulled up for spelling a word wrong. And I can spell the same word 3 different ways in one piece because I've just got no idea how to spell it when I get there. So reasonable adjustment, you'll find it in schools, in the education system, in universities. It's maybe extra time would be given to certain people for their challenges. So it's interesting though, this parallels, because we're speaking about your study journey at the moment, this parallels into practice, because we can make reasonable adjustments. And if you've done any neurodivergence training on working with autistic or ADHD clients, you'll notice that we would make reasonable adjustments as counsellors as well. But anyway, just going to put that word reasonable adjustments away and come back to this. So my daughter is autistic, but she is self-diagnosed. So it runs in our family. She knows what to look for, and she doesn't feel that she wants to go and have a medical diagnosis. She knows who she is and she knows how that is. But what's interesting is she's not able to get reasonable adjustments because she doesn't have a diagnosis within her university. So that's an interesting part of this as well, Rory, that you do need to demonstrate what it is that you need the support with to be able to get those reasonable adjustments. And there are times when there are kind of rules and regulations in place for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I think the rules and the regulations are actually a barrier to people getting the support they need, because, as you say, if you're told you have to have a diagnosis, it means that you're then forced, against your will, in your daughter's case, to have to go and get a diagnosis. And she, where's the autonomy there? If you're dyslexic, you talk about your handwriting, Ken. My handwriting looks like a drunken spider has staggered through an inkwell and has just kind of wandered all over the page and collapsed. And it's always been like that. No amount of shouting by teachers and slapping me around when I was younger will ever change it. And I've just come to live with it now. And it just struck me as well that unlike a lot of subjects, when teachers set reading lists, when lecturers set reading lists, they tend to set reading lists that are books that were published in the 1940s, 1940s and 1950s. And I bet if you got in a time machine, Ken, if we got in a time machine, the Counselling Tutor time machine, and we went back to the 1950s, we would have a very hard time understanding what people were talking about.
It really is about having a chat with your tutor and sharing where you find yourself and hoping that your tutor is going to support you through with some reasonable adjustments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not about hoping the tutor will notice. In my case, my tutor did. But, it would be nice to be able to speak to your tutor and say, look, this is where I'm at. This is the help I might need. And it's to be an ongoing dialogue. So if you are out there listening in podcast land and that this is you, the person we're speaking about is you as well as us, then go and speak to your tutor, ask what the policy is, ask what adjustments that can be made, negotiate it with them. They should be only too happy to do that because that will make their lives easier because they have to mark work and they want people to pass. And also keep in touch. If anything changes, if you're finding something works better, use it as a kind of collaborative effort. And hopefully you'll find your learning journey will be a bit more smooth, a bit smoother, and you'll be able to, go and do the work with confidence, which is really, what it's all about. It's a happy learner at the end of the day.
It is, yeah. And, we all have our strengths and challenges in certain areas. And I think the reasonable adjustments are there to kind of level that playing field. So it's the same for you. If you ever been in a class, and I certainly have, where you think, wow, everybody else gets this except me, and it was around my dyslexia and other stuff as well. So one of mine is that I learn best by listening to something. So if something is visually shown only or given to me as words on paper, I really struggle to take that information and put it in. Give me a podcast to listen to. Oh my goodness, I'll remember it. I can quote it. I can tell you what it's all about. If you do any of the training courses through Counselling Tutor that have assignments or a piece of written work that needs to be put in at the end, all of them have reasonable adjustments. It's in our handbooks. What we've also done, and I think this was thanks to your leadership, Rory, as the academic lead, is in our CSR library, which is our student library, and in our qualified CPD library, every single one of those resources has an audio version, a video version, a written version, a summary, and it's to address the different learning areas so that you can learn as is best for you. Because one thing I remember from us teaching together, Rory, is very often someone who might really have challenges in an assignment, if you sat them down and say, just tell me in your own words about Carl Rogers's 7 stages of process, they could do that. But the barrier was in putting it down. So we all have our strengths, we all have our challenges. Reasonable adjustments are there to balance that. And it's just left to say, Rory, as we're back out of student services, that this has been episode 350 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
It has been, Ken, and we started with ethical and sustainable practice. Starting as a counsellor, what you need to know, how to make yourself into a 21st century therapist and hopefully attract more clients or make yourself more employable. Straight into practice matters with a fantastic interview with Mel Ciavucco, who talked about disordered eating and weight loss drugs, a conversation really of our time. And then in student services, Ken and myself meandered around the point of getting reasonable adjustments on a counselling course. What are reasonable adjustments and the actions that you can take to make sure that if you need them, your counselling journey goes as smooth as possible. And it just goes for me to say thank you for your shares, your likes and your comments. And until we meet again, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.